Chapter 6. The education of Honourable Patches was begun without further delay. Because Phil's time was so fully occupied with his four-footed pupils, the dean himself became the stranger's teacher, and all sorts of odd jobs about the ranch, from cleaning the pig pen to weeding the garden, were the textbooks. The man balked at nothing. Indeed, he seemed to find a curious, grim satisfaction in accomplishing the most menial and disagreeable tasks. And when he made mistakes, as he often did, he laughed at himself with such bitter mocking humor that the dean wondered. "He's got me beat," the dean confided to Stella. "There ain't nothing that he won't tackle, and I'm satisfied that the man never did a stroke of work before in his life. But he seems to be always trying experiments with himself, like he's expecting himself to play the fool one way or another, and wanting to see if he would, and then, when he don't, he's surprised and tickled as a kid." The dean himself was not at all above assisting his new man in those experiments, and so it happened that day when Patches had been set to repairing the meadow pasture fence near the lower corral. The dean, riding out that way to see how his pupil was progressing, noticed a particular cross-tempered shorthorn bull that had wandered in from a nearby range to water at the house corral. But Phil and his helpers were in possession of the premises near the watering trough, and his shorthorn majesty was therefore even more than usual out of patience with the whole world. The corral was between the bull and Patches, so that the animal had not noticed the man, and the dean, chuckling to himself and without attracting Patches' attention, quietly drove the ill-tempered beast into the enclosure and shut the gate. Then, riding round the corral, the dean called to the young man. When Patches stood beside his employer, the cattleman said, "Here's a blamed old bull that don't seem to be feeling very well. I got him in the corral all right, but I'm so fat I can't reach him from the saddle. I wish you'd just halter him with this rope so I can lead him up to the house and let Phil and the boys see what's wrong with him." Patches took the rope and started towards the corral gate. "Should I put it around his neck and make a hitch over his nose like you do a horse?" he asked, glad for the opportunity to exhibit his newly acquired knowledge of horses and ropes and such things. "No, just tie it around his horns," the dean answered. He'll come all right." The bull, seeing a man on foot at the entrance to his prison, rumbled a deep-throated threat and pawed the earth with angry strength. For an instant, Patches, with his hand on the latch of the gate, paused to glance from the dangerous animal that waited for his coming to the dean, who sat on his horse just outside the gate. Then he slipped inside the corral and closed the gate behind him. The bull gazed at him a moment, as if amazed at the audacity of this mere human, and then lowered his head for the charge. "Climb that gate, quick!" yelled the dean at the critical moment, and Patches climbed, not a second too soon. From his position of safety, he smiled cheerfully at the dean. "He came around all right, didn't he?" The dean, full rounded front and thick shoulders, shook with laughter, while Senor Bull dared the man on the gate to come on down. "You crazy fool," said the dean admiringly, when he could speak. "Don't you know any better than to go in there on foot?" "But you said you wanted him," returned the chagrined Patches. "What I wanted," chuckled the dean, "was to see if you had nerve enough to tackle him." "Well, to tell you the truth," returned Patches with a happy grin, "that's exactly what interested me as well." But while the work assigned to Patches during those first few days of his stay on the Cross Triangle was chiefly those odd jobs which called for no or little experience, his higher education was by no means neglected. A wise and gentle old cow-horse was assigned to him, and the dean taught him the various parts of his equipment, their proper use, and how to take care of them. And every day, sometimes in the morning, sometimes late in the afternoon, the master found some errand or business that would necessitate his pupil riding with him. When Phil and Miss Baldwin would inquire about the Dean's kindergarten, as they called it, the Dean would laugh at them, but always he would say stoutly, "Just you wait. He'll be near as ready for the rodeo this fall as them pupils in that kindergarten of Phil's. He takes to riding like the good Lord made him specially for that particular job. He's a natural born horseman, and if he ain't, I don't know men. He's got the sense, and he's got the nerve, and he's got the disposition. He's going to make a top hand in a few months if," he always added with twinkling eyes, "if he don't get himself killed trying some fool experiment with himself."
"I happen to notice that he always has plenty of help in his experimenting,"
Miss Baldwin would return dryly, which saying indicated not only the Dean but Phil and every man on the cross triangle, including little Billy. Then came that day when Patches was given a task that, the Dean assured him, is one of the duties of even the oldest and best qualified cowboys. Patches was assigned to the work of fence riding. But when the Dean rode out with his pupil early that morning to where the drift fence begins at the corner of the big pasture and explained that riding a fence meant in ranch language looking for breaks and repairing any such that was found, he did not explain the particulars of that kind of fence. "I told him to be sure and be back by night," he chuckled as he explained Patch's absence at dinner to the other members of the household.
"That's downright mean of you, Will Baldwin," chided Stella with her usual motherly interest in the comfort of her boys. "You know the poor fellow would lose himself sure and out there in those wild Tallyholt mountain country."
The boys laughed. "Oh, we'll find him in the morning, all right, Mother," reassured Phil. "He can follow the fence back, can't he?" retorted the Dean. "Or, as far as that goes, old Snip, he'll bring him back home."
"If he knows enough to figure it out, or let Snip have his head,"
added Curly. "At any rate," the Dean maintained, "he'll learn something about the country, and he'll learn something about fences, and maybe he'll learn something about horses. And we'll see whether he can use his own head or not. There's nothing like giving a man a chance to figure things out for himself sometimes. Besides, think what a chance he'll have for some of his experiments. I'll bet a yearling steer that when we do see him again, he'll be tickled to death at himself and wondering how he had the nerve to do her."
"To do what?"
asked Miss Baldwin. "I don't know what," chuckled the Dean, "but he's bound to do some fool thing or another just to see if he can, and it'll be something that nobody but him would ever think of doing, too." However, Honorable Patches did not get lost that day. That is, not too badly lost. There was a time, though, but that did not belong just here. Patches was very well pleased with the task assigned to him that morning. For the first time he found himself trusted alone with a horse, on a mission that would keep him in the full day in the saddle, and would take him out of sight of the ranch house. Very bravely he set out, equipped with his cowboy outfit, except the riata, which the Dean, fearing for experiments, had at the last moment thoughtfully borrowed it, and armed with a fencing tool and staples. He was armed, too, with a brand-new 6-gun in a spick-and-span holster on a shiny belt of bright cartridges. The Dean had insisted on this, alleging that the embryo cowboy might want it to kill a sick cow or something. Patches wondered if he would know a sick cow if he should meet one, or how he was to diagnose the case of any certainty if she was sick enough to kill. The first thing he did when the Dean was safely out of sight was dismount and examine his saddle girth. Always your real king of the cattle range is careful for the foundation of his throne. But there was no awkwardness now when he again swung to his saddle. The young man was in reality a natural athlete. His work had already taken the soreness and stiffness out of his unaccustomed muscles, and he seemed, as the Dean had said, a born horseman. As he rode, he he looked over the surrounding country with the expression of independence, freedom, fearlessness, every very bit different from the manner of the troubled man who had faced Phil Acton that night on the Divide. It was as though the spirit of the land was already working its magic within the man. He patted the holster on his side and felt the handle of the gun, lovingly fingered the bright cartridges in his shiny belt, leaned sideways to look admiringly down at his fringed leather chaps and spur-ornamented boot heels, and wished for his Rietta, not forgetting meanwhile to scan the fence for places that might need his attention. The guardian angel who cares for the tenderfoot was good to Patches that day, and favoured him with many a sagging wire and leaning or broken post, so that he could not ride too far. Being painstaking and conscientious of his work, he made not more than 4 miles by the beginning of the afternoon. Then he found a break that would occupy him for 2 hours at least. With rueful eyes he surveyed the long stretch of dilapidated fence. It was time, he reflected, that the dean sent someone to look after his property, and dismounted, he went to work, forgetting, in his interest in the fencing problem now, to ensure that his horse was nearby attendance. Now the best of cow horses are not above taking adventures and advantages of their opportunities. Perhaps Snip felt that the fence riding was with a tenderfoot was a little beneath the dignity of his cow-punching years. Perhaps he reasoned that this man, who always was doing such strange things, was purposely dismissing him. Perhaps he was thinking of the long watery trough, the rich meadow grass that was back at home. Or perhaps, again, the wise old Snip, feeling the responsibility of his part in training the dean's pupil, merely thought to give his inexperienced master a lesson. However it happened, Patches looked up from his work some time later to find that he was quite alone. In consternation he stood looking about, striving to catch a glimpse of the vanished Snip. Save a lone buzzard that wheeled in curious circles above his head, there was no living creature in sight. As fast as his heavy leather chaps and high-heeled boots would permit, he ran to the top of a knoll 100 yards away. The wider range of country that came within the circle of his vision was as empty as it was silent. The buzzard wheeled nearby. The strange-looking creature beneath it seemed so helpless that there might be the situation that something of a vital interest to the tribe. Even buzzards must know about their business. There are few things more humiliating to a professional rider of the range than to be left afoot, and while Patches was far too much a novice to have acquired that particular and traditional tastes and habits of the clan of which he had that morning felt himself a member, he was, in this, the equal of the best of them. He thought of himself walking shamefaced into the presence of the dean and reporting the loss of the horse. The animal might be recovered, he supposed, for he was still, Patches thought, inside the pasture which that fence enclosed. Still, there was a chance that the runaway would escape through some break and never be found. In any case, the vision of the grinning cowboys was not an attractive one. But at least, thought the amateur cowboy, he could finish the work that was entrusted to him. He might lose a horse for the dean, but the dean's fence should be repaired. So he set to work with a will, and finished that particular break, and set out on foot to follow the fence around that field, and so back to the lane that would lead him to the buildings and corrals of the home ranch. For an hour he trudged along, making hard work of it in his chaps, boots, and spurs, stopping now and then to drive a staple or brace a post. The country was growing wilder and more broken, with cedar timber on the ridges and here and there a pine. Occasionally he would catch a glimpse of the black, forbidding walls of Tallyholt Mountain. But Patches did not know it was Tallyholt. He only thought that he knew in which direction the home ranch lay. It seemed to him that it was a long, long way to the corner of that field. It must be a big pasture indeed. The afternoon was well on when he paused on the summit of another ridge for a rest. It seemed to him that he had never in all of his life been quite so warm. His legs was aching, he was tired and thirsty and hungry. It was so still that the silence hurt, and that corner fence was nowhere in sight. He could not, now, reach home before dark, even if he should turn back, which he decided grimly he would not do. He would ride that fence if he camped there 3 nights on the journey. Suddenly he sprang to his feet, waved his hat, and hallooed and yelled like a wildman. 2 horsemen were riding up the other side of the fence, along the slope on the next ridge at the edge of the timber. In vain, Patches strove to attract their attention. If they heard him, they gave him no sign, and presently he saw them turn, and ride into the cedars, and disappear. In desperation, he ran along the fence, down the hill, and across the little valley, and up the ridge on the other side where the riders had gone. On the top of the ridge he stopped again, to suspend the last of his breath in another series of wild shouts, but there was no answer, nor could he be sure even which way the horseman had gone. Dropping down in the shade of a cedar, exhausted by his strenuous exertion and wet with honest perspiration, he struggled for breath and fanned his hot face with his hat. Perhaps he even used some of the cowboy words that he had heard Curly and Bill employ when little Billy wasn't around. After the noise of his frantic efforts, the silence was more oppressive than ever. The Cross Triangle ranch house was somewhere endless miles away. Then a faint sound in the narrow valley below him caught his ear. Turning quickly, he looked back the way he had come. Was he dreaming, or was it all just a part of the magic of this wonderful land? A young woman was riding towards him, coming at an easy swinging lope, and following, at the end of a riata, was a cheerfully wise and philosophical Snip. Patch's first thought, when he sufficiently recovered from his amazement to think at all, was that the woman rode as though he had never seen a woman ride before. Dressed in divided skirt of corduroy, the loose, soft grey shirt, gauntlet gloves, and mannish felt hat, and boots usual to the Arizona horsewoman, she seemed so much at ease in the saddle as any cowboy in the land, and indeed she was. As she came up the slope, the man in the shade of the cedar saw that she was young. Her lithe, beautifully developed body yielded to the movement of the spirited horse she rode with the unspoiled grace of health and youth. Still nearer, he saw her clear cheeks glowing with the exertion and excitement, her soft brown hair under the wide brim of the grey sombrero, and her dark eyes shining with the fun of her adventure. Then she saw him and smiled, and Patches remembered what the dean had said. "If there's a man in Yokpai County who wouldn't ride the hooves off the best horse in his outfit to win the smile from Kitty Reed, he ought to be hung." As the man stood, hat in hand, she checked her horse, and in a voice that matched the smile so full of fun and clean joy of living, greeted him. "You must be Mr. Honorable Patches, are you not?" Patches bowed. "Miss Reed, I believe?" She frankly looked her surprise. "Why, how do you know about me?" "Your good friend, Mr. Baldwin, described you," he smiled. She colored and laughed to hide her slight embarrassment. "Oh, the dear old dean is prejudiced, I fear." "Well, prejudiced he may be," Patches admitted, "but his judgment is unquestionable, and," he added gently as her face grew grave and her chin lifted slightly, "his confidence in any man might be considered an endorsement, don't you think?" "Indeed, yes," she agreed heartily, her slightest coldness vanishing instantly. "The dean and Stella told me all about you this afternoon, or I should not have ventured to introduce myself. I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Patches," she finished with a mocking formality that was delightful. "And I'm delighted to meet you as well, Miss Reed, for so many reasons that I can't begin to tell you of," he responded laughingly. "And now, May I ask what good magic brings you like a fairy in the storybook to the rescue of a poor stranger in his hour of despair? Where did you find my faithless Snip? And how'd you know where to find me? Where's the Cross Triangle Ranch, and how many miles is it to the nearest water? Is it possible for me to get home in time for supper?" Looking down at him, she laughed as only Kitty Reed could laugh. "You're making fun of me," he charged. "Oh, they all do. And I don't blame them in the least. I've been laughing at myself all day."
"I'll answer your last question first," she returned. "Yes, you can easily reach the Cross Triangle in time for supper, if you start at once. I will explain the magic as we ride."
"You're going to show me the way?" he cried eagerly, starting towards his horse.
"I really think it would be best," she said.
"Now I know you're a good fairy, or a guardian angel, or something of that kind," he returned, setting his foot in the stirrup to mount. Then, suddenly he paused with, "Wait a minute, please, I nearly forgot." And very carefully, he examined the saddle girth to see if it was tight.
"If you had remembered to throw your bridle reins over Snip's head when you left him, you wouldn't have needed a guardian angel this time," she said.
He looked at her blankly over the patient Snip's back. "And so that's what made him go away? I knew I had done something silly that I ought not to have. That's the only thing about myself that I was always perfectly sure of," he said as he mounted. "You see, I can always depend upon myself making a fool. It was that bad place in the fence that did it." He pulled up his horse suddenly as they were starting. "And that reminds me, there's one thing you positively must tell me before I go afoot, even towards supper. How much further is it to the corner of this field?" She looked at him in pretty amazement.
"To the corner of this field?"
"Yeah, I know, of course, that if I follow the fence, it's bound to lead me around the field and so back to where I started. That's why I kept on. I figured I could finish the job and get home, even if Snip did compel me to ride the fence on foot."
"But you don't know that this is a drift fence?" she asked, her eyes dancing with fun.
"Well, that's what the dean called it," he admitted, "but it's drifting anywhere it goes on end. Perhaps that's why I couldn't reach a corner."
"There's no corner to a drift fence," she cried.
"No corner?" She shook her head as if not trusting herself to speak. "And it doesn't go around anything? Is there no field?" Again she shook her head. "It just runs away out in the country somewhere and then stops?" She nodded.
"It must be 18 to 20 miles from here to the end."
"Well, of all the silly fences!" he exclaimed, looking away to the mountain peaks towards where he'd been laboriously making his way. "Honestly now, do you think that's any respectable way for a fence to act? And the dean told me to be sure and get back before dark." Then they laughed together, laughed until their horses must have had a bit of a wonder on. As they rode on, she explained the purpose of the drift fence, and how it came to an end so many miles away, so far from water that the cattle do not usually find their way around it. And now the magic," he said. "You have made a most unreasonable, unconventional, and altogether foolish fence appear reasonable, proper, and perfectly sane. Now, please explain your coming with Snip to my relief."
"Which was also unreasonable, unconventional, and altogether foolish?" she questioned.
"Which was altogether wonderful, unexpected, and delightful," he retorted.
"It's all perfectly simple," she explained. "Being rather," she hesitated, "well, rather sick of too much nothing at all, you know. I went over to the Cross Triangle right after dinner to visit a little with Stella, professionally."
"Professionally?" "Yes." She nodded brightly.
"Yeah, for the good of my soul. Stella's a famous soul doctor. Best one ever, except maybe she lives far, far away back over in Cleveland, Ohio."
"Yes, I know her too," he said gravely. And while they laughed at the absurdity of his assertion, they did not know until long afterwards how literally true it was.
Of course, I knew about you, she continued. Phil told me how you tried to ride that unbroken horse the last time he was at our house. Phil thinks you're quite a wonderful man.
No doubt, said Patches mockingly. I must have given a rather remarkable exhibition on that occasion. He was wondering just how much Phil had told her.
And so, you see, she continued, I couldn't very well help being interested in the welfare of the stranger who had come among us. Besides, our traditional Western hospitalities demand it, wouldn't you think?
Oh, certainly, certainly. You could really do nothing less than inquire about me, he agreed politely.
And so, you see, Stella's sort of restored my soul's health, at least afforded me temporary relief.
He met the quizzing, teasing, and laughing look in her eyes blankly. You're making fun of me again, he said humbly. I know I ought to laugh at myself, but...
Why, don't you understand? She cried. Dr. Stella administered a generous dose of talk about the only new thing that's happened in this neighborhood for months and months and months.
Meaning me?
Well, are you not?
Well, I guess I am. What about it?
Well, I came away feeling much better, of course.
Yeah?
I was feeling so much better that I decided I should go home a roundabout way, and perhaps to the top of Black Hill, perhaps up Horse Wash, and where I might meet Father, who might be on his way home from Fair Oaks, where he went this morning.
I see.
Well, and so I met Snip, who was on his way to the Cross Triangle. I knew, of course, that old Snip would be your horse.
She smiled as though to rob her words of any criticism of his horsemanship. Exactly, he agreed understandingly.
And I was afraid that something might have happened, though I couldn't see how that could be either with Snip, so I caught him up.
He interrupted eagerly. How?
Why, with my rope, she returned with a matter-of-fact tone, wondering at his question.
You caught my horse with your rope? He repeated slowly.
And pray how should I have caught him? She asked.
But didn't he run?
She laughed. Of course he ran. They all do that once they get away from you, but Snip couldn't outrun midnight, she retorted.
He shook his head slowly, looked at her with frank admiration as though for the first time he understood what a rare and wonderful creature she was. And you can ride and rope like that, he said doubtfully. She flushed hotly, and there was a spark of fire in her brown eyes.
I suppose you are thinking that I am coarse and mannish and all that, she said with spirit. By your standards, Mr. Patches, I should have ridden back to the house screaming ladylike for help.
Oh, no, he protested. That's not fair. I was thinking how wonderful you are. Why, I would give what I wouldn't give to be able to do a thing like that. There was no mistaking his earnestness, and Kitty was all sunshine again, partnering him with a smile.
You see, she explained, I've always lived here except for those 3 years at school. Father taught me to use a rope as he taught me to ride and shoot because, well, it's all just part of life and it's very useful. Just as it's useful to know about hotels and times tables and taxi cabs in other parts of the world.
I understand, he said gently. It was stupid of me to notice it. I beg your pardon for interrupting the story of my rescue. You had just roped Snip when he was doing his best to outrun midnight. Simple and easy as it's calling a taxi. Number 2000 Elsud Avenue, please. And there you are.
Oh, do you know Cleveland? She cried.
For an instant he was confused, and then he said easily, well, everyone's heard of famous Elsud Avenue. But how did you guess where Snip had left me?
Why, Stella had told me you were riding the drift fence, she answered, tactfully ignoring the evasion of his question. I just followed the question. So there's no magic to it about it at all, you see.
I'm not so sure about the magic, he returned slowly. This is wonderful country, to me, that one can never be quite sure about anything. At least I can't. Perhaps that's because I'm such a new thing."
"Do you like it?"
she asked, frankly curious about him. "Like being a new thing?" he purred. "Yes and no."
"I mean, do you like this wonderful country, as you call it?"
"I admire the people who belong to it tremendously. I've never met such men before, or such women," he finished with a smile.
"But do you like it?" she persisted. "Do you like the life, your work? Would you be satisfied to live here always?"
"Yes and no," he answered again, hesitating.
"Oh, well," she said, with, he thought, a little bitterness and rebellion. "It doesn't really matter to you whether you like it or not, because you're a man. If you're not satisfied with your environment, you can just leave and go away somewhere else and make yourself a part of some other life."
He shook his head, wondering a little at her earnestness. "That doesn't always follow. Can a man, just because he's a man, always have or do just what he likes?"
"If he's strong enough," she insisted, "but a woman must always do what other folks like."
He was sure now that she was speaking rebelliously. She continued on.
"Can't you, if you're not satisfied with this life, go away?"
"Yes, but not necessarily to any life I might desire. Perhaps some sheriff wants me. Perhaps I'm an escaped convict. Perhaps, 1,000 things." She laughed again, in spite of her serious mood.
"What nonsense!"
"But why nonsense? What do you and your friends know about me?"
"We know that you're not that kind of a man," she retorted warmly, because she hesitated. "Well, because you're not that sort of a man."
"Are you sure you don't mean because I'm not man enough to make myself wanted very badly even by the sheriff?" he asked, and Kitty could not mistake the bitterness in his voice.
"Why, Mr. Patches, how could you think such a thing? Forgive me, I was only wondering foolishly what you, a man of education and culture, could find in this rough life that would appeal to you in any way. My curiosity is unpardonable, I suppose, but you must know that we're all wondering why you're here."
I don't blame you," he returned with that self-mocking smile, as though he was laughing at himself. "I told you I could always depend upon making a fool of myself, and you see, I'm doing it now. I don't mind telling you this much, that I'm here for the same reason that you went to visit Miss Baldwin this afternoon."
"For the good of your soul?"
she asked gently. "Exactly," he returned gravely. "For the good of my soul."
"Well then, Mr. Honorable Patches, here's to your soul's good health," she cried brightly, checking her horse and holding out her hand. "We part here. You can see the cross-triangle buildings over yonder. I go this way."
He looked his pleasures as he grasped her hand in hearty understanding of the friendship offered. "Thank you, Miss Reed. I still maintain the Dean's judgment's unquestionable." She was not at all displeased with his reply.
"By the way," she said, as if to prove her friendship, "I suppose you know what to expect from Uncle Will and the boys when they learn about your little adventure."
"I do," he answered, as if resigned to anything.
"And do you enjoy making fun for them?"
"I assure you, Miss Reed, I'm very human."
"Well then, why don't you turn the laugh on them?"
"But how?"
"They're expecting you to get into some sort of a scrap, don't you think?"
"Well, they're always expecting that," and he added with the droll touch in his voice, "I must say I rarely disappoint them."
"I suspect," she continued thoughtfully, "that the Dean purposely did not explain that drift fence to you."
"He has established precedents that might justify my thinking so, I'll admit."
"Well then, why don't you just ride cheerfully home and report the progress of your work as though nothing had happened?"
"You mean you wouldn't tell?" he cried. She nodded gaily.
"I told them this afternoon that it wasn't fair for you to have no one but Stella on your side."
"Well, what a good Samaritan you are. You put me under your everlasting obligation, though.
All right, she laughed. I'm glad you feel that way about it. I shall hold that debt against you until some day when I'm in dreadful need, and then I shall demand payment in full. Goodbye.
Once again, Kitty had spoken, in jest, words that held for them both, had they known, a great significance. Patches watched until she was out of sight. Then he made his way happily to the house to receive, with a guilty conscience but a light heart, congratulations and compliments upon his safe return. That evening, Phil disappeared somewhere in the twilight, and a little later, Jim Reed rode to the cross triangle doorway. The owner of the Pothook S was a big man, tall and heavy, outspoken, somewhat gruff, with a manner that to strangers often seeming that of overbearing. When Patches was introduced, the big cowman looked him over suspiciously, spoke a short word in response to Patches' commonplace, and abruptly turned his back to converse with the better-known members of the household. For an hour, perhaps, they chatted about matters of general interest and neighbours' will. Then the caller rose to go, and the Dean walked him to his horse. When the two men were out of hearing of the people on the porch, Rita asked in a low voice, "You notice any stock that don't look right lately, Will?" "No. You see, we haven't been riding scarcely any since the 4th. Phil and the boys been busy with the horses every day, and this new man, he doesn't count, you know." "Who is he, anyway?" asked Reed bluntly. "I don't know any more about him other than he says his name is Patches." "That's a funny name," grunted Jim. "Yeah, but there's lots of funny names, Jim," the Dean answered quietly. "I don't know as Patches is any funnier than Skinner, or Foot, or Hog, or hundreds of others' names when you come to think about it. We ain't just never happened to hear it before, that's all." "Where'd you pick him up?" "He come along and wanted work. He's as green as they make 'em, but willin', and he's got good sense, too." "Well, I'd go slow about taking strangers in," said the big man bluntly. "Shucks," retorted the Dean. "Some of the best men I ever had was strangers when I hired them. Being a stranger ain't nothing against a man. You and me would be strangers if we was to go many miles from Williamson Valley. Patches is a good man, I tell you. I'll stand for him all right. Why, he's been out all day alone, riding the drift fence, just as good as any old-timer." "The drift fence?" "Yeah, it's in pretty poor shape in places." "Yeah, and I ran into a calf over on Horse Wash this afternoon, not 400 yards from the fence on the Tally-Holt side, fresh branded with the Tally-Holt iron, and I'll bet $1,000 it belonged to a cross-triangle cow." "What makes you think it was mine?" asked the Dean calmly. "Well, it looked mighty like your Hereford stock, and because I came in through the Horse Wash gate, and about half a mile on this side, I found one of your cows that had just lost her calf." "They know we're busy and ain't riding much, I reckon," mused the Dean. "If I was you, I'd put some hand that knew to ride in that there drift fence," returned Jim significantly as he mounted his horse. "You're plumb wrong, Jim," returned the Dean earnestly. "Why, the man don't know a cross triangle from a 5-bar or a Pothook S." "Well, that's your business, Will. I just thought I'd tell you. Good night," growled Reed. "Good night, Jim. I'm much obliged for your riding over." End of chapter 6.